I have a not altogether unique, but wholly unhealthy aversion to public restrooms. My colleagues know this because I avoid the restroom in our house as much as possible. If I'm on a drive and nature calls, I drive faster to try to get home. I like the comfort. And it's not a germ thing for me. There's just the issue of the sounds and the smells and the whole thing. It's just the whole thing's weird. And so you may wonder why I decided that I'm going to talk about this. Well, I understood there would be no field research involved with this talk. And so we can sort of move forward in understanding like where we are with regard to negotiating the space in public lavatories. This is a photo. It was taken right here on campus. You may recognize it if you've been in Newhall. Chris Pasco snapped this one for me because I don't creep around in the dorms. That would be bad too. And it is not uncommon to see buildings with new construction that are offering all-gender facilities. And as we start to think about what that means and how we've come along to this point, I wanted to sort of just put this image in your mind as you'll start looking for signs and maybe some confusion for you about which space is yours, where am I supposed to go. There's a lot of folks who have been wrestling with that for many years, and we're just starting to come to answers that will be acceptable to those folks. This isn't a new topic. This is a great edited volume, right? You might pick up in your spare time, where scholars are sort of weighing in on both the history and the politics of public toilets. This one's a good one. I like the imagery here. Ladies and gents, public toilets and gender, right? So there's literature here. There's scholarship in these areas. But it's not the first time we had to discuss segregation in public facilities, particularly bathrooms. These signs will be, you'll recognize from Jim Crow era America, particularly in the U.S. South, where white Americans and black Americans were expected to not occupy that same space, to use public facilities separately. And so that part of it is behind us. We don't have those kind of differentiations anymore. We do have this differentiation still. Maybe it's flacos and flacas if you're in a Mexican restaurant or whatever it is. You're going to get some signal when it's time to use the restroom of which one is appropriate, which space is appropriate for you to occupy. And before you get too excited and say, yeah, well, professor, that's because there's biological differences, and so we need to separate those, I'll remind you of what some of the arguments in favor of Jim Crow segregation were. And they're very much rooted in arguments about biology and racial differences and so forth. And so that's too easy. We can't just stop there. But it's important to recognize that this is not, first of all, it's not completely common worldwide to have gender-segregated facilities. In many parts of the developing world, it is not common at all. And it wasn't even common here until really into the 19th century, where there were requirements to provide public spaces. But we are mandated to do that now, building codes. There are international codes. The employment spaces are governed by OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which is part of the Department of Labor. There are guides providing restrooms in workspaces. With regard to public restrooms, the Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level also has guidelines that are in place. And as any good political science student knows, in addition to those guidelines, there will be a whole slew of state and municipal codes, building codes, related to the way construction has to happen, down to making how many restrooms have to be available, how many toilets have to be available based on the potential occupancy. If you've been to Wrigley Field, you know how that is, right? Especially in the men's room, you know how that is. It's pretty much just a free-for-all, and there's a big long trough in there, and good luck, and just try not to miss. Is pretty much the game in Wrigley Field. But there are codes that guide all of these things, and the codes more or less emphasize gender segregation. And in fact, in most places, it is required that if you have only 2 toilets, you have to designate one for males and one for females. They have to be designated that way. In some areas, it's not the case, but in most of the places, it is. And so this is what we're dealing with, and this is sort of the state of our laws today and where that is. But I don't know what we're afraid of. Why do we have gender-segregated restrooms? Are we afraid of somebody from the opposite sex seeing us in various states of undress or going about our business? If so, isn't that a very, very heteronormative concern, right? Why are we not worried about being seen by people of the same gender when we're in those restrooms? This is former U.S. Senator Larry Wide Stance Craig. In 2007, Senator Craig was caught up in a sting operation in the Minneapolis airport as he was traveling between Washington, D.C. and his home state of Idaho. The police had been tipped off that there was some lewd behavior taking place in one particular men's restroom at the Minneapolis airport, and so they set up an operation. Senator Craig was noticed to be moving around in a kind of curious way back and forth on the outside of the restroom, and then inside the restroom sort of peering through a particular stall, and then moving away, and then peering. And at some point he occupies the neighboring stall, taps his foot a number of times, which the officers understood to be a signal to indicate that a person was interested in engaging in some lewd behavior. Senator Craig's foot then touched the officer's foot in the stall next to him, and his hand reached under the stall, cupped upward was the accusation. Senator Craig argued that he was trying to pick up a piece of paper at one point, and also argued that perhaps he has a wide stance when he uses the restroom, and that's why his foot may have touched the officers next door. So it's not that we are immune from understanding that there might be a sexual activity in public restrooms, whether it's warranted or whether it's wanted or whether it's not. But there's still sort of a really deep heteronormative component to this gender segregation in the restroom. Well, it comes into friction with folks who identify as transgender, because most of our identification with gender has been conflated with sex, particularly sex assignment at birth, right? And so when folks identify as transgender, oftentimes they have a decision to make. They have to either do what I do, which is drive faster and hold it, which isn't a bad idea, whether you're transgender or not, I just would say. Or they have to make a decision about which restroom they're going to use and face potential consequences if they're identified as somebody who, by law, ought not be occupying that space. These kind of facilities, all-gender restrooms, can alleviate some of that. We see also that it's not simply about being transgender. It's about having caring for somebody with a disability that might be of the opposite gender. Anybody who's had sort of young kids but not babies have had this sort of situation. Do I take my daughter in the men's room? I mean, I've had it, obviously. But what about caring for a disabled adult? If you have an autistic child or an autistic person that you're trying to help. All these questions come in. Nobody really cares if a 5-year-old girl's in the men's room. That doesn't really matter. But some women get really upset when a 14-year-old boy is in the women's room, but he's autistic and can't use the restroom without his mother's care or a caregiver's care. So those are all kinds of things we have to think about. Sheamus Johnston is a transgender man who was assigned female sex at birth. And therefore the birth certificate indicates female, but had been living as a man for some time, even before he enrolled at the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown. He preferred to use male restrooms and facilities, locker room facilities, as you might imagine, because he identified as male. The institution prohibited that and admonished him on a number of occasions to stop. He refused, and he was expelled from the university. The federal court last fall upheld that expulsion, saying that it was not a Title IX issue and that the university acted appropriately in that dismissal. Other types of conflicts that are happening both at the court level and the legislative level didn't work necessarily that way. For instance, we have proactively in the schools in San Francisco, the elementary schools in San Francisco, all-gender restrooms being introduced, and not as a result of any particular student asking for accommodations or any conflicts that were occurring, but as sort of a recognition of the inherent friction that exists in restrooms that are segregated by gender. Just up the road, District 211 in Palatine, of course, if you've been following the news, you know that they've had a lot of conflicts, that there was a transgender girl, a young woman, who was wanting to use the locker room facilities, and the district came up with some kind of compromise where there would be a separate space in the women's locker room for her to use. Some of the parents were very upset about that. Other parents were very supportive, and so this is sort of an ongoing concern. Here, the federal government was involved in that case too, the Civil Rights Unit of the Department of Justice, and so that's an important one. And as you might expect, it's America. Somebody's making money off of this. There's a company now who specializes in these kind of signs, right? The kind of, because you're going to need a whole bunch of signs. Somebody's got to make the signs. But it raises a good point. When there's new construction, as we saw here on campus with New Hall, it makes sense. It'd be very difficult for me to imagine new construction where there wasn't at least a number of all-gender facilities. But what happens to the older buildings? What about our dorms that we already have on campus? What about our other campus buildings that are here? What do we do about those? How can we retrofit in some way? But that also presupposes that we're not paying attention to James Madison. Yes, of course. Every political scientist has a favorite founding father, and every political scientist probably has a favorite Federalist paper. Mine's a little cliche, it's number 10. But we're going to talk about James Madison's argument real quickly here, that he's wrestling with, or asking us to wrestle with, this notion of majority beliefs, passions, and how that's balanced. That will gets balanced against the protection of minority interests. The minority interests here don't have to be transgender individuals. I don't want you to limit yourself to that thinking. But just folks who might believe that it would be better not to have gender-segregated restrooms for any of the reasons that we've discussed here today, right? And so how do we make sense of that in a way that's good for everybody? Because, again, when you're talking about the vulnerability that's involved, some of us are a little more hung up than others on using public facilities. There's some vulnerability involved here, and so people's feelings are at stake, and so these are sensitive issues. But you may remember Ally McBeal. Some of you are old enough to remember Ally McBeal, right? Ally McBeal was a television show about a law firm that was aired in the 1990s, and one of the features that is memorable of that show was that the restroom in the office was unisex. It was all gender. Everybody used the same restroom, but it was a multiple facility restroom. It wasn't like just one toilet and then you close the door. So men and women would be in there together. And so this is what the depiction here is. I think that very few people are concerned about having single occupancy, all gender restrooms, right? In some ways, you're happy when you see that. Yeah, I don't have to have anybody beside me when I'm trying to do my stuff. I'm going to be in there by myself. Everybody's okay with that, right? But what if we can't, again, with new construction, we might be able to offer a number of those. Should we be thinking about, though, either retrofitting or maybe not being so hung up? Everybody's biology is about the same in terms of what's going on in there. You're vacating, right? Maybe you're not. Maybe you can do it beside somebody of the opposite gender, and it's not so uncomfortable. I mean, if you think about it, we don't do this at home, but we don't have gender-segregated restrooms at home. I'm guessing most of you in your house weren't like upstairs bathroom for boys, downstairs bathroom for girls, right? You probably don't do that. Everybody just sort of shares. And again, we're comfortable with that as long as it's single occupancy. These are the kind of questions I think they're going to push us to think more and more about where we want to go. All right. So as you go to the bathroom in a public space next time, look around you, see who's there, see if anybody has a particularly wide stance, perhaps. But keep in mind our founding fathers and the questions that they asked us to consider in a broad context about majority and minority rights, and think about how they apply to our everyday life, even when you're going pee. Thank you.